welcome back to BLOCKTV. It's time now for Fireside Chats. Now the term meteoric gets thrown around a lot when it comes to the cryptoverse, but the term has never been more appropriately applied than in relation to Binance. In the 2 years since its launch, Binance has rocketed to become the largest crypto exchange in the world, regularly processing more than $1 billion in exchanges every single day. But it seems they are not satisfied with this title, recently launching their own native blockchain to establish a decentralized exchange among a myriad other projects. Today here at BLOCKTV, we've got the chance to sit with the new Chief Strategy Officer at Binance, just a few weeks into the job, who comes to the world of cryptos from an unusual route, by the NBA. I'd like to welcome Chao. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Asher. Pleasure to be here.
All right, so just a few weeks into the job, so firstly, congrats for starting the new position.
Thank you, thank you.
How does it feel? We're moving from the world of NBA into the world of crypto. What prompted the move, and how do you feel now you've been in the job a couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, I'll make a quick correction to that. The announcement is a few weeks old, but we embargoed that for a little bit, so
Sure.
I've actually been on the job for a little over 6 months. But it's been a whirlwind tour, amazing team, and the contrast between the NBA and Binance couldn't be more stark, but there are some similarities, and I think you alluded to it in the introduction that Binance has really risen quite quickly in the brand recognition, at least within the industry, seems to mirror at least NBA in sports and prior companies that I've worked at in their respective industries. So, yeah.
Certainly, Binance does have that energy and feel about it that makes a lot of people feel that buzz, I guess, similar to the sporting world. But I want to ask as well, I mean, you've come in at a tumultuous time. This has been a huge year for cryptos as a whole, for Binance specifically. Some of the most major and significant events of the cryptoverse are already really taking shape and taking form this year. But I want to touch specifically on some of the outcomes that have come up for Binance recently and what it's meant for you taking on this position. So first, obviously, I want to talk about the relationship, the release of the new Binance Mainnet and the creation of the decentralized exchange. How has that sort of played and impacted you guys as you've developed?
Yeah, well, I think we've been fortunate with the timing coming out of the crypto winter, but it's difficult to time any market, much less cryptocurrency. So we've really just been keeping our heads down and building and releasing as quickly as we can, and we happen to be catching a good time. So I think with the latest revamp in the website, some of the things you can see in the interface, some improvements that were taken from a lot of user feedback. Other things you may not be able to see, but there should be increased stability, increased reliability on transactions, and those types of things that aren't as tangible until things break. So those are some improvements. With the DEX, really this is an area, and you know, we've spoken quite a bit on this through other executives, but the DEX is really another option, and we do see it as a viable and really the way forward that's consistent with the I guess the ethos of crypto being decentralized. And so we do recognize that there is a user base that is much more interested in the security that provides, and they're willing to trade that off with some of the centralized, say, customer service that you can get from .com. So the rationale behind that is we don't want to stand still. If we do see that there is another and potentially better option, it's too early to say that now, but we would like to be the ones to introduce that, and I think in the future you'll keep seeing that from us.
Well, certainly that desire not to stand still does seem to be at the core of Binance's ethos, even as new developments are occurring. There's talk coming out now, coming from yourself, in fact, that you're considering becoming a Libra validator node. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, news travels fast.
Certainly does.
Yeah, we have engaged with Facebook. And we're very excited about the Libra project. I think a few months ago, without as much detail, we weren't certain that this was something that we could cooperate with, but it looks like they're heading in a direction that we're extremely excited about, and I think the whole industry is. And so, yeah, to the extent that we can be part of that, we would like to. And you know, it's still early days. But I think the potential that Libra can have, not just on mass adoption, but what it means to payments and what it means, frankly, in forcing regulators' hands probably to catch up a bit, is all good news. It's not going to be easy, but things that need to be addressed. And so we look forward to working with Libra as much as we can.
It's an interesting question, though, to bring into sort of talking about Libra and bringing that into a wider discussion around regulation. Now, this is something that Binance has been working very hard in recent times, particularly to really get a strong sense of compliance and a real open and transparency when it comes to regulation. Obviously, most notably, your shift in stance towards your US user base. Yeah. What can you tell me regarding sort of Binance's overarching strategy when it comes to dealing with regulation and dealing with that in so many jurisdictions, as obviously you operate so far around the world?
Yeah, good question. I would say largely we, in the face of uncertainty, particularly with regulators, we don't feel that we're in the position to sort of try to influence them. I know we do have a large say in the crypto industry, but these are organizations that have to deal with things much broader than just crypto. So our stance generally has been to wait and see, and then as things become certain, then we'll respond to them as quickly as possible. So with regard to the U.S., we have recently announced that we have a U.S. partner that will be offering a dedicated destination and platform for U.S. users to onboard and go through the proper KYC process that's compliant with the U.S. And as things become clearer in other parts of the world, we'll act similarly.
And certainly when it comes to regulation, when it comes to dealing with issues, Binance has taken perhaps somewhat unique approach when it comes to its transparency, particularly led through your CEO, CZ, who is very fond of really responding to the community directly when issues occur, such as, of course, the infamous hack that unfortunately occurred earlier this year on Binance. Immediately, CZ came out with this, the AMA, the open communication. This is something he's continued, and Binance has continued throughout. Even so recently, when the large sum of Bitcoin was transferred, 9,001 Bitcoin were transferred, and he let out a reassuring message. This is sort of in contrast to a lot of other players in the cryptoverse generally, but even in corporate world overall that don't necessarily have that degree of transparency. What sort of would you say is different about the ethos of Binance that makes that the more appropriate mechanism?
Well, I think we do want to lead by example where we can. So in the case of the regulatory environment, I don't think we can do that, but in our world we can. And so it's interesting. I think we're big believers in transparency, and there's actually this constant friction between transparency and privacy. And we do, in cases where there are gray areas and uncertain what people prefer, we do listen to the community. But as a corporate culture, transparency is pretty essential. And I think building the trust and building the goodwill that we've been able to so far is really a result of that. And it starts from the top. I think the CZ, I think just naturally is that type of person, and it spills throughout the organization, and that was one of the things that frankly attracted me to Binance is the team members and the culture that he's built has been phenomenal.
Now, there are some on the flip side of the coin who say that CZ has become a bit of a cult of personality in the industry. I think we could all agree with that, but that perhaps his centralizing of sort of as a single voice in the community has gone too far. Some would say that he's has an overreach and overpower in the way that the industry works, and that Binance as a whole has a risk of having too much power. What would you say to critics like that about the role of Binance in the industry, given, as I said earlier, the meteoric rise that you guys have had in the cryptoverse?
Well, that's actually an interesting perspective that I haven't spent much time thinking about. But as you mention it, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's anything that we've gone out and demanded. I think we've just been transparent, and the followers have happened organically. We aren't spending marketing dollars out there. We're not insisting that people listen to us. I think this is all self-selected and therefore pretty authentic. And so if people are criticizing that, they're welcome to tune out, I guess. But I think there's a reason why so many people are listening. So, yeah.
Well, whether critic or fan, certainly it's undoubtable that Binance has really caused some upending in the industry as a whole, particularly with the movement towards IEOs, a field that you guys have certainly pioneered. What role do you think IEOs have coming into the future, and do you see this as the main mechanism for getting new coins to market, or is this just another step, from the ICOs, the SDOs down to IEOs? I mean, is this just the next step in a developing chain?
Yeah, I would say it's more of a next step than a final destination. I think it fills in a gap that the market didn't have prior to what happened with ICOs in 2017. I think they were looking for some kind of credibility or some kind of signaling to separate projects, because similar to what we saw in the early .com days, which I was a part of as a banker, there wasn't much differentiation among one IPO versus another. And then as the market matured and realized how to evaluate these projects, they learned, and now you see much higher quality projects, or tech companies going public. Same thing that's happening here. I think people have turned to us to be that filter, and we've welcomed the challenge to do that and the opportunity to do that. And so we're lucky to have people trust us, and we think we're running it in as fair a way as possible. We've tweaked sort of the criteria of participation along the way to try and make it as equitable and as efficient and fair as possible. And the feedback that I get is that we're doing the right things. So people, that's the constant, how do I get into the next Launchpad thing? And I ask them, well, what do you think of the criteria that we have? What would you change? And they think about this and say, well, you know what, yeah, it's fair. So they complain about not being able to get in because it's somewhat limited, but they also acknowledge that it's a fair process, and I think that's the better place to land.
I mean, fair or otherwise, I suppose I want to ask, the Binance Effect, as it's been called, what impact would you say that has in your thinking? And I want to give some examples of that. You recently had the listings of Phantom on your platform, which immediately surged 60%. Mithril as well surged 70% after being listed on Binance. Obviously, there was the high-profile delisting of BSV during the peak of the Craig Wright scandals. Binance has been said, by virtue of its position in the crypto sphere as a whole, that it has a true effect, whether intended or otherwise, on the market as a whole. What role as a strategy officer would you say you give to that, and do you think the Binance Effect is a real thing, and is it something you think about?
Yeah, it's interesting what the cause and what the effect is. I'd say in some of those cases, again, we're listening to the community. So I would hesitate. I don't want people to mistake that we're taking actions that then impact. We're oftentimes listening to what the community is saying. So it's a reflection of their voice. And I think you asked as a strategy officer, I would prefer that we act in that manner than start sort of dictating things. When it comes to our business, we'll try and act as responsibly as we can, and obviously as a company, we're trying to create value, and we want to justify our revenues. But when it comes to sort of decisions that we hear very strong voices from the community, we're going to pay attention.
And as well, speaking about sort of more in the tech side of things, and more in the ability to tech. So recently, we just had a massive transfer, $1.2 billion of Binance coin transferred, over 32 coins transferred, and CZ posted out, and I'll quote, "This transaction cost $0.015 in fees, took 1.1 seconds, and 1.2 billion in value transfer." Those are pretty amazing statistics.
Yep.
What do you say to that? Is this the future of financial transactions? Is this the ability to transfer wealth instantaneously across the globe?
Well, that actually speaks more to, I think, a business model. So whether you transfer even at a bank today, whether you transfer $100 or $1 million, what the bank is actually doing is the same thing, right? The cost of doing that is not different. And it's similar to, I spent some time on Wall Street, and IPOs, acquisitions, they're all based on a fee that's generally a percentage of the transaction. But whether you're doing a $10 million acquisition or a $1 billion acquisition, you're generally doing the same amount of work, due diligence, hiring legal fees, looking at contracts. So the costs are relatively fixed, and so there's not a real reason why it needs to be 5% or X number. You can make it a fixed fee, and I think this is a demonstration of that. So yeah, it may be long overdue in some industries.
Yeah, certainly, perhaps. But do you feel that you might be upsetting some in the banking world with this sort of action? Is that an antagonism that you keep in mind in your day-to-day actions, or do you try and work in partnership, I guess, with some of these bigger players?
Well, I don't think we're trying to be antagonistic. I think they would need to take a look in the mirror and ask why they hadn't done this earlier. I think if you can offer equal or better service at a better price, then that's sort of just market dynamics. With regard to working with banks, if banks want to reach out to us and work together, I think we would certainly welcome a dialogue, but we have not in the other direction reached out because we are pretty clear on what we'd like to do and offer, and it's pretty clear on the demand side that people appreciate it. So.
But do you see yourselves as market disruptors?
I don't think we have anywhere written in our mission or goals or plans to be a market disruptor, but yeah, I think the consequences of what we're doing, we are disrupting certain markets.
And looking forward to some of the projects, and I remember when you were brought on, or when the embargo was lifted about you being brought onto the Binance team, there was a lot of talk about you developing Binance's venture capital arm, the Binance Labs, and particularly getting more fiat to crypto gateways into Binance. What's the state of some of those projects, and sort of what are the key priorities of Binance at this stage?
Sure. Well, these are teams and initiatives that already existed when I came on board, and frankly, they're actually well-developed teams and operate quite well on their own. My goal is really to help them communicate and coordinate a little more closely so that we can be a little more efficient. As you can imagine, we have projects and potential partners actively pinging us constantly through various channels, and so this was really a way to coordinate a little bit better. But to answer your question on going forward, Labs, for example, is over a year old now, and they've built a nice portfolio. I would say a year ago that they had sort of a very broad scope of looking at anything that grows the blockchain ecosystem. And now, as we've gone through a couple incubation seasons and the market's matured, our focus has matured as well. And so we'll be looking a little more closely at projects with token economics. We're certainly interested in projects that can use tokens on our chain. So there are some reprioritizations, but the scope hasn't changed broadly. We are now carving out of Labs a team that will focus on developers and building a developer platform to really attract tech talent to the ecosystem. That's something that will be working in parallel. And again, these initiatives already existed. We're just trying to structure them in a way that'll be more effective. On the, on Launchpad. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so clearly probably one of our highest profile initiatives this year, incredibly successful. I think the projects we've launched so far have an aggregate return 600%. And so part of me feels that we don't want to set the expectation that everything is going to skyrocket. So we do need to start hopefully moderating expectations, but the market is what the market is. I think given the environment that we're entering into, things are looking much more bullish. We will try to accelerate the offerings of Launchpad. So right now we've been pacing at about one a month. and we'll see. Given the quality, we don't want to change our standards. So, but we think that there are enough projects out there that could benefit from Launchpad, and we'll try to accelerate that pace. I also think that valuations and the offering size, the appetite is out there, and but we do want to make sure that we keep realistic ranges on valuation. We don't want to contribute to sort of overhype.
Bubble, as it were.
Yeah.
But I got to say, I mean, talking about the projects that you have under development, also just generally in the state of the market, the exchange it's, as a central project, the decentralized exchange, the IEOs, I mean, the vast array of products and developmental works being put out by Binance at the moment. If we were to pull back from it and look at the wider, I suppose, macro strategy picture, do you envisage Binance as a one-stop shop for everything crypto? Is that the sort of end goal, as it were? Or where do you look to that long-term macro picture for where Binance sits in a future, more mature crypto sphere?
Yeah. Excuse me, and I apologize for the weak voice today.
That's right.
Yeah, I don't know that I would term it as a one-stop shop, but I think we will hopefully be a critical part of the ecosystem going forward. I think, and this isn't a new statement, but ultimately the goal is to be an infrastructure provider to crypto. So I think I'll use an analogy that CZ's used a number of times in the past, that we want to be building the roads, and there's certainly plenty of other talent out there to be building the buildings and et cetera. But I look at it a little bit more as plumbing. So if we can ultimately be the plumbing in the industry, I think that would be great. As far as long term, where we would want to be, that's a difficult that's difficult for me even to envision, given how we plan, by quarter, and oftentimes by months, and something will come up, and an entire week we'll have to focus on one particular issue. So for me to try and extrapolate out to 5-10 years, which I've been asked to do many times, is difficult. But I'll say this: I think one of the big milestones that I would hope to see during that time is that there's some cryptocurrency, whether it be Bitcoin or other, that can become sort of a legitimate quote currency. I think that's the signal that there's true adoption. So it's not just I hold crypto, but for me to use it, that prices are actually quoted in that currency. And I think Libra is probably at least the first project I've seen that has the potential to do that.
On. As well, I mean, fair enough, I understand the difficulties, the Binance itself 2 years old, the market itself 10 years old, yourself only in the position for 6 months, extrapolating into the future, obviously when there's not that much past is a tough game, but I suppose we can't finish this interview without talking about the elephant in the room, of course, that the massive movement in the markets over the last, even the last 24 hours, but let's look a little further throughout 2019. It's been a massive back upswing. Binance coin is at all-time highs. Many other coins are really rapidly approaching some serious market movement. Looking ahead at the market as a whole, any thoughts, any ideas on where you think we're all headed? Are we at the start of a bull run that's going to continue for a while?
Well, I think the best way for me to answer that is to look to the past. There's 10 years of data. And it looks like we're entering what I would call, I guess, the fourth cycle. So there's been 3 major corrections in the history of Bitcoin. And in the previous cycle, you saw a lot of correlation between all the tokens going up and down together. More recently, you've seen a little bit of, I guess, uncorrelated activity among certain coins. And so I think that is a sign that people are starting to differentiate between sort of what they trust a little bit more and what's a little more speculative, and what they may not believe in as much. And I think that's a good thing that people are starting to make that differentiation. The other thing is the adoption. So in 2017, we saw an order of magnitude increase in adoption. If that happens through this cycle, we'll be close to I think, a tipping point, if you think of 10% adoption globally being a tipping point. So those are all positive things. I think, looking historically, we're probably looking at a fairly decent time frame here for what will happen. I'm not one to make predictions, but if you look at just historical patterns, we're probably looking at new highs, at least for Bitcoin, 50 to 100,000 range is not out of the question. And when you refer to all-time highs with our coin, it's funny, like many times we don't know about it until we see it on Twitter that people are remarking about it. And I think that's a good thing for people to just, any company, if you're looking at your stock price all the time and you're trying to manage by that, whether it's quarterly earnings or market expectations, you're going to lose sight of what you really need to do. So we try not to get too caught up in that. Certainly we celebrate milestones because it is an accomplishment, but we can't operate by looking at the movements of these coins. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. I think it's worked so far.
Well, certainly it does seem to be working so far. As market leaders, you guys are pulling ahead and making big changes and disruptions in the industry. I want to thank you, Chao, for coming in to speak with us today
thank
on
you.
BLOCKTV.
Pleasure.
And please stay with us on BLOCKTV for all the latest news and developments in and around the cryptoverse. I'm Asher Westrop Evans. Thanks for watching.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter